UAV arrived at the USS Indianapolis at 18,000 feet. And what it found should have stayed hidden. A ship that carried the most dangerous secret in American history vanished. 879 men for 4 days. Nobody came. Not because they couldn't, because somebody decided not to. And now, 78 years later, a drone descends into the darkness, 18,000 feet below the surface, and finds something in that cargo bay that the United States government is still not ready to explain. Welcome to Marine Discovery Hub, where history's most powerful secrets become today's most important lessons. If this is your first time here, take a moment, look around, subscribe. Think of it like reading a newspaper, the kind your grandfather used to read every single morning without missing a single day. And before we go any further, drop a comment below. Tell us, where in the world are you watching this from today? We read every single one. Now, let's begin. In the summer of 1945, the United States Navy handed one ship a mission so secret that even the captain was only told half the truth. That ship was the USS Indianapolis. Her captain was Charles Butler McVeigh III, a career naval officer, a man whose father had been an admiral, a man the Navy trusted with missions it could not afford to fail. And in July of 1945, they gave him the most important delivery in the history of modern warfare. At the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, the Indianapolis was loaded in silence. No announcement. No official record that anyone outside the highest levels of command was permitted to see. A 15-foot wooden crate was lifted carefully onto the hangar deck. A large metal canister was welded, not strapped, not secured, welded directly to the floor of the captain's cabin. McVeigh asked what he was carrying. He was told it could shorten the war. He was told to move fast. He was told to tell no one. That was the entire briefing. A man responsible for over 1,100 lives, crossing one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the Pacific War. Given instructions that fit inside 2 sentences, the institution trusted him enough to hand him the mission. It did not trust him enough to tell him what he was actually protecting. The Indianapolis departed San Francisco on July 16, 1945. She crossed the Pacific at maximum speed. She arrived at Tinian Island on July 26 and offloaded her cargo with the same silence in which she had received it. 12 days later, 2 Japanese cities were gone from the map. The wooden crate and the welded canister had carried the enriched uranium core of Little Boy. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, the Indianapolis had delivered the weapon that changed the world. Then she received new orders. Proceed to Leyte Gulf. Report for crew training. Continue the mission. She departed Guam on July 28, 1945, her historic delivery complete. Her crew exhausted, and her captain holding a set of sealed orders for the return leg that have never been fully declassified to this day. Nobody told the crew what they had carried. Nobody told them what was about to follow them into the dark water of the Philippine Sea. And nobody in any office, at any naval station, was watching closely enough to notice when the Indianapolis simply disappeared. 3 stations received the distress signal. 3, and not one of them moved. This is not a story about a Japanese torpedo. That torpedo did its job in seconds. What happened next? It took 4 days. And what happened next was entirely American. When the Indianapolis went down on July 30, 1945, approximately 900 men entered the Philippine Sea. They had life jackets, some had rafts. They had each other. And they had the reasonable expectation that the most powerful navy in the history of the world would come looking for them. That expectation was wrong. The first receiving station got the distress signal and dismissed it. The commanding officer later testified that he assumed it was a Japanese trap, a fake signal designed to lure American vessels into an ambush. He made that decision from the comfort of a dry office. He did not investigate, he did not escalate. He simply decided the men in the water were not worth the risk of being wrong. The second station received the same signal. The officer on duty was intoxicated. He took no action. The third station logged the signal and filed it away. Standing orders suggested that false distress calls were sometimes used as enemy bait, so the officer followed procedure. He followed it so carefully that 579 men died while the paperwork sat in a folder. 3 independent failures. 3 separate human beings. 3 different reasons for doing nothing, and the result was mathematically precise. 579 men who survived the sinking did not survive the rescue that never came. But the silence did not end with the distress signal. When the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf on schedule, nobody noticed. The officer responsible for tracking vessel arrivals later testified that he assumed the ship had been diverted. He assumed, he did not verify. He did not investigate. He did not pick up a telephone and ask a single question. Standard naval procedure required that any vessel failing to arrive on schedule trigger an immediate inquiry. That procedure existed precisely because the ocean is dangerous and warships carry human lives. The procedure was ignored on day 1. It was ignored on day 2. It was ignored on day 3. On day 4, a patrol aircraft pilot named Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn spotted an oil slick from the air. He looked closer. He saw men floating in the water. He broke radio silence immediately and called for rescue. He was not part of the naval command structure that had failed these men. He was simply a pilot who looked down and saw human beings who needed help. And he acted within minutes of seeing them, something 3 receiving stations and an entire naval arrival. Tracking system had failed to do across 4 complete days. By the time rescue vessels reached the survivors, the groups that had entered the water as hundreds had become handfuls. The Philippine Sea had done its work. The sharks had done their work. Dehydration and madness and exhaustion had done their work. 317 men were pulled from the water alive. 879 were dead. And here is what every serious analyst of institutions, military, corporate, or governmental, must sit with when examining this disaster. The torpedo that sank the Indianapolis killed men in seconds. The institutional silence that followed killed nearly 3 times as many across 4 days of complete organizational paralysis. The Japanese submarine did not cause the death toll of the USS Indianapolis. The chain of command did. When an organization builds a system in which every individual assumes someone else is responsible, nobody is responsible. When procedure becomes a reason to avoid action rather than a framework for taking it, the procedure itself becomes the weapon. The Indianapolis disaster is not a military curiosity. It is one of the most precise case studies in institutional failure ever documented. 3 stations, 4 days. 579 preventable deaths. The torpedo took 12 minutes to sink the ship. The silence took 96 hours to finish the job. The ship was gone. The men were dead. And the United States Navy had a problem. Not the problem of 879 families waiting for answers. Not the problem of 3 receiving stations that had ignored a distress signal. Not the problem of a naval command so organizationally paralyzed that one of its warships went missing for 4 days without a single inquiry. The Navy's problem was simpler than all of that. Someone had to be blamed, and that someone was already chosen before the court-martial ever began. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III received his charge sheet in November 1945. He was accused of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag the standard evasive maneuver used to complicate submarine targeting. In the entire history of the United States Navy across the entire duration of World War II, McVeigh would become the only American naval commander court-martialed for the loss of his ship in combat. Not the officer who filed the distress signal and took no action. Not the officer who was intoxicated when the message arrived. Not the officer who assumed the Indianapolis had been diverted and never made a single phone call to verify. Not the admiral who approved a routing plan that sent a heavy cruiser across the Philippine Sea without escort. McVeigh, the Navy's case rested on one argument. Had McVeigh been zigzagging at the time of the attack, the Indianapolis might have survived. It was a clean charge, it was documentable, and it placed the entire weight of 879 deaths on the decisions of one man standing alone on a bridge in the middle of the Philippine Sea at midnight. There was only one problem with that argument. The man who fired the torpedoes said it wasn't true. Commander Makasora Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine captain who sank the Indianapolis, was brought to Washington to testify at the court-martial. He sat in an American courtroom in front of an American military tribunal and told them directly that zigzagging would not have changed the outcome. At the speed and distance from which he had fired his Type 95 torpedoes, the result would have been identical regardless of the pattern McVeigh was sailing. The prosecution's own witness destroyed the prosecution's own case. The Navy convicted McVeigh anyway. The survivors who had floated in that water for 4 days, who had watched their fellow sailors taken by sharks and driven mad by thirst and lost to exhaustion, understood immediately what the court-martial actually was. It was not a search for truth. It was a redirect, a carefully constructed institutional mechanism designed to absorb public anger, satisfy grieving families, and protect the command structure whose failures had actually determined the death toll. The 3 officers whose inaction had condemned 579 men to die in the water were never formally disciplined. Their names do not appear in any court-martial record. Their careers continued. The admiral who approved the unescorted routing, whose decision placed the Indianapolis in the Philippine Sea without the protection a ship of her class and her mission should never have crossed without faced no formal consequence. McVeigh went home to a mailbox full of death threats. Families of the dead, told by a Navy tribunal that their sons and husbands had died because of one man's negligence, directed their grief exactly where the institution had pointed it. Letters arrived at McVeigh's home for years. Letters blaming him, letters cursing him. Letters from people who had been given half a story and told it was the whole truth. He carried that weight for 23 years. In November 1968, Charles Butler McVeigh III walked into the front yard of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, and shot himself. His gardener found him holding a small toy sailor in his hand. The man who had delivered the atomic bomb components that ended World War II died alone in his front yard, holding a toy. In the year 2055 years after the sinking, Congress passed a resolution formally exonerating McVeigh. President Clinton signed it. The Navy amended his record. The official acknowledgement was real. The accountability for the men whose failures had actually shaped the disaster was not. No posthumous charges, no amended records for the officers who slept through a distress signal, no formal consequence for the command structure that lost a warship for 4 days and called it a clerical oversight. The exoneration gave McVeigh's name back. It gave nothing to the 879 men at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, and it answered none of the questions that the wreck itself was still waiting to ask. For 72 years, the Philippine Sea kept its secrets perfectly. 18,000 feet of cold, crushing, absolute darkness. A depth that made every search attempt before the age of autonomous underwater vehicles essentially theoretical. The Indianapolis had gone down in water nearly 2.5 times deeper than where the Titanic rested. She was not hiding. She was simply unreachable. Until she wasn't. In August 2017, Paul Allen, the same man whose research vessel had located multiple lost warships across the Pacific, funded and led the expedition that finally found her. His team did not begin with technology. They began with archives. Survivor accounts, deck logs of nearby vessels, post-war reconstruction of ship movements. They built their search grid from primary sources rather than assumptions. They identified a section of the Philippine seafloor that every previous search had classified as low probability and left uncovered. On August 19, 2017, an autonomous underwater vehicle sent its sonar returns to the surface. The profile that appeared on the monitor matched a Portland-class cruiser lying on the bottom at 18,000 feet. Cameras descended, and there, still visible on a section of the hull after 72 years of darkness, was the name Indianapolis. The world had found the ship, but finding the ship was only the beginning of what the technology would eventually reveal. Because the moment researchers examined the initial sonar imagery, questions emerged that the standard historical account could not answer. The distribution of debris across the seafloor did not match expected patterns. The configuration of the forward cargo spaces showed objects whose dimensions and geometry did not correspond to anything on the official manifest. Objects precise enough in their shape to suggest manufactured components rather than loose naval stores. Objects arranged with a deliberateness that suggested intentional placement rather than routine stowage. The questions were documented, filed, and largely set aside because 2017 technology, extraordinary as it was, could only see so much at that depth. 2023 changed everything. A research team deployed a new generation of autonomous vehicles carrying capabilities that made the 2017 expedition look primitive by comparison. Multi-beam sonar systems, high-resolution imaging arrays, three-dimensional reconstruction algorithms accurate to the centimeter. They descended into the Philippine Sea and spent weeks mapping every surface of the wreck and the surrounding debris field with forensic precision that no sunken vessel at that depth had ever received. What they found in the forward cargo spaces triggered a classification review at the Department of Defense that is still ongoing today. The objects documented in the cargo bay do not match any standard equipment inventory for a Portland-class cruiser of that period. Their geometry is too precise. Their arrangement is too deliberate. And their presence in a cargo space that the Navy has always described as containing nothing of classified significance has forced a question back into official channels that 78 years of institutional silence had successfully suppressed. What did the Indianapolis take on at Tinian before she sailed? The sealed orders McVeigh received at Tinian have never been fully declassified. His executive officer, in a 1968 interview that was archived and largely forgotten until the drone's footage made people remember it, stated that the captain had received a document pouch at Tinian that was not connected to standard navigation orders. The classified loading logs from the Tinian facility covering the period of the Indianapolis's visit have never been released. The Navy's official position has always been that the ship was carrying nothing of significance on the return leg. The three-dimensional scans suggest otherwise. And this is where the story stops being history and becomes a lesson that every serious analyst of institutions, corporate, governmental, or military, must absorb completely. The most dangerous information in any powerful organization is never what appears on the official record. It is what was deliberately kept off it. The Indianapolis disaster has always been taught as a story of enemy action and individual negligence. A Japanese torpedo, a captain who failed to zigzag, a tragedy of war. Version of the story is clean. It is manageable. It protects the institution that produced it. But the drone footage has now documented three distinct layers of truth that the clean version cannot contain. A cargo that may never have been fully disclosed. A distress signal that 3 stations chose to ignore. And a court-martial that convicted the one man the institution needed to sacrifice, while quietly closing every file that pointed anywhere else. The wreck is not going anywhere. 18,000 feet of water and the crushing pressure of the Philippine Sea are the most permanent archive ever created. Whatever sits in that cargo bay has survived 78 years of darkness, pressure, and institutional silence. It will be there when the classification review concludes, if it ever concludes. It will be there when the answers are made public, if they ever are. The Indianapolis carried the weapon that opened the atomic age. She was destroyed before that age fully began. And the men who went down with her died without knowing what their mission had meant, what it had changed, or what the institution they served was already preparing to do with their memory. The ocean keeps things. But as the drone footage of a cargo bay at 18,000 feet has now proven to the entire world, it does not keep them forever. The wreck has spent 78 years waiting to testify. The technology has finally arrived to hear every word it has to say, and somewhere in the Department of Defense, people who know exactly what was on that manifest are watching drone footage of a cargo bay and deciding how much of what the Indianapolis has waited nearly 8 decades to reveal. The world is finally allowed to know.